Oh,
event
we're
with the
live, Cher.
Toolkits Live. Oh, are we? Oh,
Um,
okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the nonfiction session of Toolkits Live. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm streaming in from Wurundjeri country today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also invite anyone who's watching right now who'd like to share what country they're on to just put that into the chat and sit for a moment and think about the country that you're on and your relationship to it. So, I'm going to start off by introducing myself and then share. I'm going to read my own bio in the third person, which can be kind of cringe, but I don't see another way around it. So, hi, I'm Hasib Harani. Hasib is a Lebanese Palestinian writer, editor, and arts worker. He's a 2020 recipient of the Wheeler Center's Next Chapter scheme, and his 2021 essay, When We Blink, was shortlisted for the Liminal and Pantera Nonfiction Prize. He's currently completing a debut book of suffocation and the occupation of Palestine. You can find his work in Meanjin, Overland, and Going Down Swinging, among others. And with us today is Cher Tan. Cher is an essayist and critic. Her work has appeared in the Sydney Review of Books, Kill Your Darlings, Runway Journal, Gusher magazine, and Overland, amongst others. She is an editor at Liminal and the reviews editor at Meanjin. Hi, Cher, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. I
Mm-hmm.
think we'll have a lot to talk about
Yes.
for this
Yeah,
session.
I'm hoping we can burn through everything we've got um, to say. But firstly, just some housekeeping. Toolkits Light is an 8-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in unique and exciting online environments. Toolkits is run by Express Media. Express has been around for 30 years, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, like VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits is generously supported by Australian Poetry. This session tonight will be available on YouTube as a resource and will also be captioned in the coming days. So, in today's session, Cher and I are going to unpack how institutions might serve writers, the pathway into a writing career, and how it might not necessarily have to start off with a degree or an institution. We're going to be thinking about the different mechanisms for learning about craft, how we can access them outside of the tertiary education system, and how we can take what they have to offer and leave the rest behind. Also, there is a live chat for today's stream. And so if you'd like to ask any questions, you can do so in the comments section or via Twitter by using the hashtag EM Toolkits. And yeah, you're welcome to ask questions as they come up. But Cher and I we might get distracted. So we'll just keep coming back to the chat and hopefully not miss any of your questions. So, I just want to start off by defining what an institution is in this session, and then maybe giving a little bit of context to uh, our respective relationships with literary institutions and how we've worked with them in the past, how we continue to work with them. But Cher, if you want to kind of take it away and unpack institution, and we can have a little bit of a conversation around that first.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Uh, well, to me, I see institutions as, obviously universities, but then I also think about, non-grassroots art galleries and
Mm.
like government funding bodies, non-profit orgs, even newspapers, like you know newspapers, and people have access and like move easily across these spaces. I guess like that to me constitutes an institution.
Mhm.
What do you think?
Yep, I agree. I don't have anything else add to it. But I just wanted to mention, keeping in mind that organizations that, like even grassroots organizations that are, for example, like funded by or accept funding from government bodies, can still technically kind of be lumped into that institutional framework. And so it is really tricky to define, and the avenues are everywhere, especially if you want to publish your writing. It kind of feels inevitable. You're going to be dealing with institutions regardless.
Yeah, totally. Because like
Um,
writing, I think especially exists in this ivory tower of this
mhm,
cultural capital sort of
mhm.
space, right? So
Yeah,
that's why people associate writing with institutions when it's not
exactly.
necessarily, it may not necessarily be the case. It's just
Yeah,
the
but it
writing
feels
that
like
you
such
see
a
most visibly, I think.
and traditionally feels like such a high art, with tricky access points. But Cher, do you want to give a little bit of context into your past, or maybe your pathway into a writing career yourself, how institutions were a part of that, and then to what capacity you work with them now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I feel like I've been repeating this a fair bit, and I really hate repeating myself. But uh, not to you. I mean, in general. But I came into writing being extremely online, like first through blogs, like message boards, zines, and through punk and DIY subcultures I grew up in, and am still fairly embedded in now. Um, I also grew up in Singapore where access to non-state sanctioned information was something I could only find online and luckily in libraries. Um, but then this seems increasingly the way now for many people, despite where they live, because so much fake news and propaganda. So I think it's something we can all draw from. Uh, I didn't go to uni. I apparently have a year 10 equivalent in the seen in the Australian eyes. But I didn't go to uni for a variety of reasons, like mostly class and mental health reasons, which I won't go into here. But it was getting into punk and DIY for me, and having access to the internet, which really kickstarted my writing practice. um, and then when I moved to so-called Australia a decade ago, I began submitting pitches to places like Overland, Peril, Lifted Brow, which had this open submission sort of thing where you didn't necessarily have to have lots of bylines for them to accept your work. So I've kept it up fairly steadily since then. It stops and starts, but it's mostly how it all began.
Cool. And now you work, as the reviews editor at Meanjin, which I guess technically we'd call an institution, and
I would call
Liminal.
it an institution
Yeah.
because it's associated to Melbourne Uni. And then
Mm-hmm.
Liminal, I would consider a semi-institution because we are funded by arts grants.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of visibility with both platforms in the sense of,
Mm-hmm.
um, I guess, being fairly popular, like in the mainstream writing and art worlds.
Mm-hmm.
So that is my connection to institutions now.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for sharing. I'll kind of explain my backstory as well. I also grew up in a place with not much access to free or open source content. I grew up in the UAE in the Gulf, which actually had pretty heavy censorship laws even on the internet. So when net neutrality was a ripe conversation a few years ago, that was the first time I actually learned that wasn't the norm. So uh, yeah, a lot of the writing that I had access to was in print. It was bookshops, and even with the bookshops and libraries that I was able to access literature through, that was still being vetted and censored. Um, and then moved to Melbourne in 2016, right after high school, and actually started pursuing a creative writing degree, and spent 4 years. Took me 4 years to complete, and then by the end of my writing degree, I had all of these pieces that I wanted to start putting out into the world. I didn't really know where to start. I reached out to one of my tutors and asked if she had any idea where I could publish one of my pieces. She actually suggested The Lifted Brow, which I submitted to and did not get it accepted. So I ended up a few months later applying for, and I'd already graduated at this point, or maybe had one last subject that I needed to complete, but I was pretty much towards the end of my degree and applied for an internship at The Lifted Brow, which was an unpaid internship of, I think it's 5 or 6 people per round. And that was the beginning of my access to the literary sphere, where I was finally actually meeting people and learning about the different institutions and journals that existed. That I didn't actually have a good gauge of that while I was undergoing my university education. So it was industry work that actually introduced me to writing, and that was also when I was able to publish my first piece, which was in Jed Press, which is an online journal specifically oriented towards highlighting writing by writers of color. And then, from there, just kind of snowballed from interning at the Brow to becoming an online editor at the Brow. And then the Brow unfortunately fell apart as an institution and is slowly building back up again, which is exciting. And I also edited at VoiceWorks for a little bit, and now I just write freelance independently. And recently, last year, got accepted into the Wheeler Center's Next Chapter scheme, which is definitely, I would call the Wheeler Center one of Victoria's largest literary institutions. So it was through them that I received funding to develop and see my manuscript through to near completion.
Yeah.
That's me. And right now I don't actually, because I'm only working as a freelance writer, I publish with institutions, but I don't actually work for institutions as an editor or have any kind of like contractual obligation like I did last year with the Next Chapter. So that's me at the moment. Yeah. So I thought maybe I'd get started with some of the questions that we wanted to talk about. Cher, is there anything that you wanted to start off with? Or
no, I think that's a great way to start talking about how our work sits in and outside, because we both have similar trajectories where we're sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And also very conscious of like, I think I write for audiences or essentially I don't necessarily want my primary readership to be people who have access to academic spheres, I suppose, because I just don't. Yeah, I find that maybe a bit exclusionary. But we've just got a question before we get stuck into some of the other ones, which says, you said you use online blogs, zines, and etc. to practice your writing craft. Were there any specific online platforms you recommend? And that's to you specifically, Cher.
Oh, I mean that was in the early 2000s. I was on LiveJournal a lot, and I was on forums like arguing people and things like that, and making friends online via email. But I was saying now, even starting a blog, like WordPress, or just like random thoughts on Twitter or something. I mean, it's just like a lot of it is just, I mean, it's just spitting into the vortex, really. Like you're just sort of just testing out funny things, or ideas they've experienced. There's Tumblr as well, and there's all these platforms I feel that you can really use to practice your writing and practice writing for an audience, I think. Because I think when you know that people are watching or reading, even if they're your friends, you tend to, I don't know, just be more intentional about your values and your ethics and what you personally want to write and pursue. So
Mm.
yeah, hopefully it answered the question,
I
Elise.
definitely feel that. I think it was like a really integral part of me discovering what it is that I wanted to write. It had to be for no audience at all, but I
Yeah.
still wanted to feel like I was putting, like I wanted the pressure of putting it somewhere as opposed to just putting it in a journal. So I also had like a private writing Tumblr that was anonymous, and if
Yeah.
anyone found it, they couldn't trace it back to me,
Mm.
which I feel like that freedom was crucial in figuring that out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally. I think there's less anonymity now.
Mm,
Um and you have to have some kind of burner to sort of, write with abandon sort of thing.
mhm,
That feeling of watching you, watching me sort of thing that's
mhm.
fairly prevalent now.
Um, yeah, no, definitely. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep an eye on the chat and you at the same time, and I'm terrible at multitasking. But okay, so digging into some of the questions that you and I have set out. Let's talk about straddling. I think that's a good one to start with. Is straddling the divide between being inside the institution and outside.
Mm, mm. You want me to?
So, oh wait, I mean, yeah, go for it if you have a starting point.
Yeah, sure. I think as someone who is a first generation migrant to so-called Australian and who's working class and didn't go to university, I tend to see my work as on the outside because
Mm,
I haven't met many people like myself in publishing literary circles. But that said, I mean, I do get invited to events or get published in places which are, other institutions, say like the Wheeler Center or
mhm,
Bunjil Place, or they're adjacent, such as Meanjin, as I said before, and Liminal, which is funded by government arts grants. So it becomes this like delicate dance between the two as this income funds some of my living expenses. Um, I think it's really important to constantly interrogate that and like think about what your values are, your ethics are, even if you're getting paid for something. Like,
mhm,
are you enjoying doing this? Is something I always like
mhm,
ask myself. Like, is this going to be rewarding for me personally, not in a like monetary or careeristic sense? And so there's this definitely, yeah, there's this double bind for sure where you're sort of like, as I was saying, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You're sort of like dancing, you're just sort of like moving.
mhm.
And you try and like, you take the work seriously, but then at the same time, you're quite wary of being co opted, I think.
Yeah. And it's really tricky actually talking back to funding. I've been maybe reconciling tension myself lately around only putting in as much work as I'm getting paid for.
Mm,
Uh, but then the catch to that is that a lot of the organizations that don't have as much funding are the ones whose ethics will align with mine. And
exactly.
so me putting in more work, for example, to like into a $500, like a Meanjin review that'll pay me $500 versus like a grassroots online literary journal by and for people of color.
Mm,
It's those tensions start to make me feel a bit conflicted around trying to navigate those institutions um, and when you are in a position where you want to start leveraging your writing as like your primary source of income, the institutions are the way to go about it. Like that just unfortunately is the only way to get compensated fairly for your
yeah.
labor. Um, I wanted to ask if you maybe have cracked the code around that because I've only just recently started getting these bigger gigs that pay better, um, and I'm not so sure what how to manage my kind of time and labor effectively.
Yeah, okay. So you're asking how we can circumnavigate navigate this sort of feeling. Well,
Mhm.
I I I think it's important not to put all your eggs in one basket.
Mm,
I think especially as someone came writing like a bit later, considered compared to everyone else. I mean, it
Mm,
wasn't that late. It was like late 20s. But I think it's really important to not rely on writing, only writing for a living, I think. I mean,
mhm,
it's already not a lucrative endeavor, as we know. Um, but I think if you choose to be a full time writer, you may not be able to as easily reject a commission because you need the money, right?
mm,
And you, I don't know, you also like to ask yourself those questions when you're working with like grassroots publications too. Like I think for me, I like to compartmentalize writing and something else when it comes to
mm,
um, making money personally.
mm,
Because I think that can really sidetrack certain people because you're like, oh shit, I need it, so I better do it, and then it becomes like a half-ass sort of thing. Or,
mhm,
um, but then, there's three things I like to consider whenever I'm asked to commission. I'm asked to write for something or do a project with someone, whether it's an institution or not, which is, like, I think the first question I like to ask is it artistically rewarding? Am I just
mhm,
doing something new, interesting? Are the people I'm working with are gonna have good ethics, regardless of whether they're, because some people who work in institutions tend to be on your side. It really depends on who you're talking to. So
mhm,
you ask yourself those questions, and I guess the same question I like to ask myself is it politically important? Like what kind of impact is it going to make on a
mhm,
grassroots level?
mhm,
Like especially with digital writing, I think like like it are the people who are reading it only a certain subset of writers? You ask yourself that, or is it, yeah, is it going to be like circling this weird echo chamber where you become like this kind of token? I think
mhm,
as minoritized artists, it's so easy to fall into the trap. So yeah, and then I guess the third question I might ask myself is it socially rewarding? Like, is it gonna be fun? Like
mhm,
I'm not gonna be like, oh shit, I don't want to write this, or like, um, yeah. So I think those questions are really important, and
mhm.
yeah, I wouldn't put all my eggs in one basket, especially in late capitalist society where
Yes.
art and writing is not lucrative.
Mhm. Um, Something that you mentioned, or there are two things that actually that you mentioned that I wanted to bring up. The first one being that, for example, like you being the reviews editor at Meanjin, my only experience at Meanjin has been a really pleasant one because even though it's an institution, I was dealing with someone who is very conscious of how that space actually operates, and so maybe just a disclaimer or disclaimer to any early career artists that it's not just about the organization that you're working with, but like who is the editor and what's the history. And um, it's tricky to know this, but also maybe even doing a bit of digging into kind of where the institution's at that point in terms of um, like what funding they've accepted or uh, how things are going on the inside, because oftentimes there's like the veneer of an institution that seems really ethical, but then um, or yeah, that seems kind of clean and squeaky, and then behind the curtain, it actually can be an unsafe space for
Oh,
writers,
yeah.
particularly writers of marginalized backgrounds. And I was going to ask, and this is maybe a weird question, a weird one to ask, but are there any, Cher, do you know of any ways to do that digging around where an institution's at ethically if you don't necessarily have access to industry through friends or contacts, if you're like very early career and you've not yet established a network?
Um, I think in that case, it's I think we have to just be open to failing.
Mm,
I've certainly
mm,
made, bad decisions before, like writing for certain publications which I wasn't, happy with. And I think that's how you learn you
mm,
learn what works for you and what doesn't. Like, because the thing with writing as well, I think as an art form is just something that feels new every time you write a new thing.
Mm,
It's never this rote thing of, oh, I'll do this again. Okay, I'll do this again, you know. So every
mm,
experience is different. And I think if you're an early career writer and you are approached by some kind of institution, right? I mean, just take it, you know, try to exercise as much creative autonomy as possible. Um, and then if you fail, you know that that is just not how you want to work. Like I
mhm,
think, yeah, I don't
mhm,
think it's possible to preempt these sorts of things, especially if you don't have any idea of what goes on behind the scenes. You know, it's so
mhm,
easy, I think, for us, you know, as disenfranchised artists, to, you know, be co-opted. You know, like it's so easy to be preyed on. You know, like because our existences provide cultural capital for
mhm,
institutions, right? And if you come from a working class position, well, it's very easy to be drawn to the money and the prestige that
mhm,
comes with
mhm.
it. So I think it's important to realize this. Um, and I don't think there's a tried and tested way to just be like, I'm avoiding this, because it's like the ethical consumerism argument again. Like, if you're just
Mhm.
eating organic, what does that mean? You know, that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. Um, so I think it's important to be open to the idea that you might make a wrong choice, and that's
Mhm.
fine because you just learn from that, and then
I
you
was gonna
learn what
say,
beliefs and principles are.
yeah, every time that I've learned to stand my ground with an editor or with a journal has been because I've been put in an uncomfortable position where uh, my writing, or they've edited me or asked something of me that I don't necessarily think I want to do, and that's not a bad thing. Sometimes it's just the fact that they have a specific way to like a style guide, and then you've got to now adhere to that style guide, and
Mm.
you'll learn more about your own practice and where you'll draw the line.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, even me, when Cher, you edited the review that I wrote in Meanjin most recently, that was my point of realization where I was like, wow, I'm very particular about the language that I use,
Mm.
because I was pushing back, and I'd never thought to push, like I'd never been put in a position where I felt comfortable pushing back around
Yeah.
language. And
Yeah.
so
Right.
working with you and realizing, or like knowing that the dynamic is a safe one for me to push back in, that's when I realized how adamant I am and how strict I am with like the words I will and won't use in my writing.
Mm.
But it was only through that experience that I learned that about myself. So I definitely do think that it's a case by case basis, and you just
Yeah.
have to figure it out as you go along.
Totally. Yeah. Like
Mm,
people who are like more established always tell me like, no one knows what they're doing, they're just doing it as they go along.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
never believed it at the beginning, but I think it's true.
Yeah, I definitely think it's true. We've got a question from Twitter, which is, how do you handle it when you are signed on or contracted for something and then find out after the fact that the org or institution doesn't line up with your ethics or is problematic?
Well,
Mm,
I would, before signing the contract, personally, I would ask a lot of questions. If you already feel, you know, if it's a large institution, if it's like ACCA or like, you know, arts house or something, you have to be very adamant about
mm,
your questions. Like you don't have to make any demands or whatever, but you 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 ask the questions you need to know to
mm,
make, you know, that's when I think your values and principles, like developing what they are and reevaluating them from time to time. I think that comes in because then you know what exactly you want to ask before you sign a
mm,
contract. You know, for example, you know, say you want to do something more experimental instead of like straight up polemic for some kind of commission or something, you can ask like, oh, you know, like can I take this in a different way, like this is an example of how I want to take it, would you be comfortable with that? And then, depends on the answer, you say yes or no. But I would not recommend signing a contract before knowing what to expect.
Yeah. And just going back to what you said about questions, something that I've seen people do recently, which it's been on my to-do list to do for myself for a while now, is to put together your terms of engagement. And this can be public, or it can be something that you send out, or it can be something you use yourself as a touch point. But it's essentially just like laying out what your boundaries are and what your ethics are, so that if you've been approached or commissioned for something and you're not sure where the organization stands, you've got like a tangible list to refer to be like, okay, well, they want me to write this piece around the climate crisis, for example. And if you've got in your terms of engagement what their ethics need to be around climate justice, then you can refer to that and go to them and say, I know that you want me to write this piece. I just wanted to know what your views are around this. And even sometimes an exploration or asking about who their primary readership is can be quite helpful, because that says a lot about an institution. So if you ask like who their demographic is, that sometimes is enough to gauge what their politics and ideologies are. And
Yeah. So you feel like maybe we should ask what a publication's in uh readership is? I don't know. I feel like the readership thing can be quite tricky, because if you ask them, then they obviously give you this stock standard answer of, like,
yeah, that's true, actually.
blah blah blah. I wouldn't think about. I personally don't anyway. Like,
Okay.
I
No,
think
that's a good
about
point,
my own
actually.
community and who I want to write to, like when I'm writing myself, that sort of stuff. Yeah, like I think we are living in a time where there's enough conversation to be able to push back something that we are not comfortable with. And I guess it comes back again to not putting all your eggs in one basket, because if you're relying on writing for a living only, then it really muddies a lot of the monetary stuff. And sometimes you think, oh, I'm not comfortable writing this, but then you have to because you need to make rent or whatever. I just think that can be quite tricky.
It's a good point as well, what you were saying around like if you get a commission for something and then you just ask yourself whether or not you're creatively excited by it. I feel like that alone as a driving force feels like the piece is going to do you justice as a writer if it's something that you're actively engaged in from like a creative point of view, because at the end of the day it's about your creative practice.
Totally.
And so relying on writing for financial, relying financially on your writing then hinders, I guess, what your answer would be to, do I want to do this? And am I committed to
I've
this?
grappled with this, like getting money from government grants to work on a book, that sort of thing, as you also have experienced. Like sometimes you feel this pressure because you feel like, oh, who am I ceding to, that kind of stuff, because you feel the sense of, I don't know, like you owe them something because of, I guess, how we're conditioned to think in a capitalistic world. But I think I always like to tell people, like sometimes you can just take the money and run. Like, I don't mean like ghost them, obviously, but I think if they've commissioned you, then you as an artist have a right to like ask them, like make a point of widening the scope of the brief as much as possible, like whether it's for an essay, for a book, or whatever. Like really lean into risk and experiment. I think like if they approach you and then you ask them, can I take it another way, and they're like, yes, then just do it. Like
Yeah.
I feel that if we limit ourselves in that institutionalized way and thinking, okay, I think all of these people from Melbourne Uni is going to be reading this, so I better write it in
Mhm.
this voice. Like that's not something you're going to be able to live with. I think
Mhm.
I think an editor asked me once, like, because I was seeking some advice, and then she said, "Is this something you can live with?" It's something I think about a lot when I write something or I set a commission.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I look up at it again, like maybe 5, 10 years later, and feel like, okay, that was all right.
Mhm.
Instead of being like, oh God, I don't want to look at this ever again. Like that was terrible. So um, yeah, I think all these things are quite important to consider.
Yeah, and writing is such an embodied practice. I mean, particularly with nonfiction, which is my main domain, where you're putting yourself into it, and so you want it to be representative of yourself. And so being unyielding with who you are as a person in your writing, I think, is really critical.
Yeah, totally. Like
Mm.
I think we can write for institutions or present our work to institutions, but we have to understand that um, we have to be able to hold on to as much creative autonomy as possible,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
be proud of our practice. I know that selling out as a concept doesn't exist anymore, in this
Mm.
hyper capitalist world, but I think holding on to creative autonomy is a really
Mm.
good way of not selling out, I guess.
And I mean, you're right in that we as the writers hold the power because that's what they want work. They just want work to publish. And so if we say what it is that we want to write, they're most likely going to say yes because they need content to
Yeah,
publish to
fully.
roll out.
Like when everyone, not everyone, but many writers around us boycotted
Mm.
Saturday paper. Some people are like, yeah, they need you more than you need them,
Hmm.
which is totally true because if you are confident of your writing and you know your values and principles, then you can just like be like, well, this doesn't align with my ethics. I
Yeah.
can take it somewhere else,
Hmm.
because it's always going to be there inside me, while
Yeah.
they can just deal with whatever else.
And the Saturday paper is a really good example where writers started boycotting Saturday paper and being very public about the fact that they were boycotting. And at first, Saturday paper kind of took it and sat with it, um, but eventually they started reaching out to the writers who publicly said that they were going to stop working with them. And so that's a really big testament, I suppose, to the fact that yes, these institutions do need us, like they need writers, and they're desperate to roll out our work. And so if we are, as writers, are unyielding with our demands of the journal's ethics,
Yeah,
they'll have no choice but to align with us.
no,
But
totally.
the key to that is being unyielding.
Yeah, no, I think so.
Mm, mm. Um, I just looking through the questions that I've gotten, seeing what's a good one to go on to from here. Um, maybe let's go back and simplify it a little bit and talk about some good resources for education that bypass the need for institutions. And so, if you're not working um, or writing through an institution, where do you start learning about craft? Um,
I think firstly, zines and libraries, like
mm,
that were the two main places that really ignited all the possibilities that I felt,
mm,
you know, that I could pursue writing. But then also like websites like, LibGen, which is, libgen.is, I think.
mhm,
It's like an open source website where you can download a lot of academic books. Academic books are like so expensive. No one's
mhm,
going to be able to accumulate so much.
mhm.
LibGen's great. And then there's Monoscott, uh, Internet Archive, if you like to dig in to things that
I love I love
disappear.
the Internet Archive.
Yeah. And
Mm,
then there's ARG Fail, which is 5 five A's no 5 A's RG dot FAIL, which is kind of like LibGen as well, where you
Mhm.
can find something there, you can find something there, and then there's also library.memoryoftheworld.org. I think I
Yeah.
think the internet just really, like, people like to say, oh, like, internet's toxic, it's a hellscape or whatever, but outside of social media there's really so many resources we can
Mhm.
tap into if
Mhm.
you're a non-institutionalized artist.
Yeah,
There's
agree. And
really
even with socials, like following writers that you really like on social
yeah
media, poets in particular, I feel like are very generous with sharing not only resources but also just like teaching, like publicly sharing how they write, and giving us insight into their process, which then demystifies what writing poetry can look like. I always go back to that controversy where Ocean Vuong was like on his Instagram. Did you see that on his? Was it on Twitter or on Instagram?
I
Where
didn't.
he was talking about metaphor. I think it was a Twitter thread where he was like, "Metaphor. Here's a lesson on metaphor."
Oh
Um,
right, yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
yeah, and I'm like, that is so cool that just
yeah,
by virtue of following Ocean Vuong on Instagram, you can then see how he conceptualizes metaphor.
yeah,
Um,
totally. Yeah,
and so
even
there,
Substack newsletters. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, so that's so true. Actually, newsletters are great, especially for accessing experimental work. I feel like sometimes it can be really tricky to find like a bouncing off point or an entry point into digital literature, but signing up to newsletters is always a really good one.
mm.
Mm. Um, okay, I'm gonna ask about how how to publish slash work with institutions while also ensuring that your work remains accessible to the masses. So um, whether that be like logistically making sure that people can access your work and read it, and
Yeah,
also the content of the work being something that doesn't use lots of jargon or references that
mm.
institutions will praise, but that ends up excluding lots of audiences.
Yeah. Um, I think, Hasib, you were talking about, how accessible language is really important.
Mm,
I remember editing your piece and trying to slash few things, and then you were like, "No, I'm trying to talk to my community. I don't want to write in this way." And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's something that I totally did not think about. Being like a colonized subject." And
mm,
I think that's really important, like using accessible language and references in a way that doesn't alienate people. I think, um,
mhm,
like, you don't want to have that dry, institutional voice where it's just passive voice the whole way, and you know, just this, I don't know, this holier than thou voice, I like to say.
mhm,
Like, I think it's important to write the way you speak. Like, try and write the way you speak. Like, read it out and be like, does this sound like something I'd say?
mhm,
Authentic. Um,
mhm.
and I'm a big fan of piracy. I
Yes.
think I think that's a good way of
Mm,
uh, being more accessible to masses. Being
mhm,
against paywalls, for example, like
mhm,
like for example, during my time, well, now as reviews editor at Meanjin, I was like, I don't like paywalls. Let's just take
mhm,
it out and so people read it. And everyone was fairly amenable to the idea, so no
mhm,
paywalls in the reviews. um, um, but also just like knowing what your values and ethics are. I think reevaluating them from time to time is fairly important. So you
mm,
remember that this is what you stand for and what you want to do with your practice. And I think also, I think if we're talking about accessibility, I think we shouldn't, as much as we want to be accessible, I think we shouldn't dilute our work for the sake of
mhm,
palatability. I think palatability and accessibility are very different things sometimes.
Mm,
Um, um, and yeah, and I guess institutional support can stymie that because
mhm,
you're like, oh, I want to be as like, I want to reach as many people as possible, which is not the same as accessibility, I feel, um, because if you're pandering to, a certain like audience in mind, then I think it's not that accessible.
yeah, no, I agree. And then it becomes like this broad sweeping work that doesn't actually, it loses all of its niche and all of its nuance. I, I, something that I really had to maybe negotiate early on was, and it's something that was taught to me through institutions actually, was the idea of like, to refine and reduce an argument is what makes it accessible. And so the concepts then become simpler, as an act of making it accessible and not palatable, but maybe um, not exclusionary to the community that I'm writing for, which is not
Yeah,
necessarily, yeah, people with tertiary educations. And um, so at first I was like, yeah, that makes sense. That if you don't have all of this framework for reading, then you're not going to understand this piece. But my dad, who's not an avid reader, reads everything I publish, I believe, and understands it all and loves it. And not just doesn't just love it because he's biased and he's my father. I think it's because there are very few resources where you can engage in critical theory without necessarily needing the prerequisite of all of that, all of those references and histories that are just learned and passed down through institution. And so just reminding yourself that you don't have to simplify a concept in order to make it accessible, and don't
totally.
underestimate your readers. Like,
Yeah,
they're very clever. They're very
yeah,
clever regardless of whether or
totally.
not they've
Yeah,
had tertiary
yeah,
education.
yeah,
Give them that credit.
yeah. Seriously, like I think there's too much literalness in
Mm,
in a lot of art and writing that I witness in
yeah.
so-called Australian arts.
Yeah.
Like, and say it another way, you don't have to say like I am blah,
Yeah.
like you don't have to. You're like
And
you
see it
can
so
make
often, like so much
very
in contemporary fiction as well, where I just feel
yeah,
like as an act of trying to like broaden your readership, concepts are just so obvious.
yeah,
And you don't have to be obvious to be accessible as a writer.
totally. Yeah, yeah. I think yeah, trust the reader
Hmm. Hmm.
because who knows who's people are reading, they get it. People
Yeah.
read, they get it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, Sorry, I'm just now looking back at questions, but I also wanted to invite if anyone else who's watching has anything to ask. We've only got about 5 minutes left of kind of this open discussion, and I realized I forgot to remind people as we were chatting to ask questions. So I'll maybe wait and see if anyone has any questions for Cher or for myself before we wrap
Yeah,
up.
I forgot because
I
I was having a Zoom chat.
Maybe while we're waiting for those to filter in, I'll ask what research means in a non-institutional context.
Yeah. I guess research and lived experience to me is very inextricable to
Mm,
my practice. Like, I think for me, lived experience feeds in my research and vice versa. Like, I always like to say, I'm vibing, like,
mhm,
and then I back it up intellectual inquiry to try and figure out, what it means to live in this world, this society right now. Because I work primarily in nonfiction as well, and I think as well, like it's important to like honor the artistic legacies that came before us, and I think
mhm,
for minorist artists like us working in a Eurocentric art world, there's often like a impetus to say something like, "Oh, we were the first. It's never happened before." It's you
mm,
know, um, that can become a thing, I think. But with research, we often find out, it's not the case. And I guess it comes back to the links between research and lived experience.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, like, even referencing conversations you had with people, like that is research and that is a reference because you're
Totally.
acknowledging again that you're not the first person to think of this in your community.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
you may be the first person to codify it, you may be the first person to write it down, but these thoughts and these concepts are like not always new.
No,
And so,
no.
we
Yeah.
do have a few questions. Sorry, I'm just gonna, in the interest of time, read out the first one, which is: have you both had interactions with institutions in other nation states? If so, why did you reach beyond so-called Australia?
I personally have not. Uh, I I didn't become a writer till I moved to so-called Australia because there weren't that many avenues to pursue being a writer and artist in Singapore for me.
Mm,
Because people who are artists or writers there tend to be, Ivy League educated. It's a very you know, classed sort of thing there, more so than here, um, because of, I guess, the state sanctioned stuff. So yeah,
mm.
I haven't had interactions in other places.
Yeah, no, I haven't either. And I think the reason for that being, I think it's just a timing thing of my career as a published writer started or really started to take off as we went into lockdown. And so I haven't really broadened my lens internationally, even though, me speaking really candidly, I do believe that the majority of my readership wouldn't necessarily be within Australia. I and I'm hoping to branch out, but I don't know what that looks like. And I do think that the Australian landscape is quite insular, especially with print publishing. I don't think that print publishers are that interested in international distribution or international book deals, which makes it really tricky if you are thinking about publishing elsewhere to actually take that leap. A lot of it is independent work and research that you need to do yourself as a writer and advocate for yourself as a writer in those spaces as well.
Mm.
Yeah. And then I think this is a two-part question if I'm catching up on the comments properly. So the second part of that question is, what do you think the advantages and disadvantages of this are for emerging writers, young and not so young alike, of branching out outside of Australia?
Advantages branching
Of
out
branching
outside of
out.
Australia.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I think Australia is a very parochial, has a very parochial arts scene. Like if you can go further, then I would beg you to do so. Like, I think it's very siloed here. Um,
Mm,
it's very strange to me. I mean, I've not personally worked outside of so-called Australia institution wise, but but I can definitely see how some people are very embedded in it and
mhm.
they can't really leave it, so to
Yeah,
speak.
and I think the Australian landscape, again, speaking candidly, is it's quite social in terms. There's like social, which maybe that carries over in everywhere else as well, but it definitely feels like um, the motivation for lots of writers to kind of remain as Australian writers only in this geopolitical landscape is because that there's like a social network attached to it that you're also accessing, um, and so branching out then makes your writing less social. I don't know if I worded that correctly, but it ends up being you're not just writing, there's not as much of an identity attached to it, I suppose, when you're publishing internationally. Um, yeah. Just a few more minutes if anyone has questions before I formally wrap up. And just a reminder as well to everyone who's here, who's part of the Toolkits cohort, we're going to be migrating to a Teams, like a closed Teams video chat, so that we can keep the conversation going with everybody.
Someone asked something about grassroots journals.
Oh, I must have missed it. Oh, there it is. You talk about submitting to grassroots journals as an early career writer. Do you have any recommendations for ones to approach?
I guess
The one that you go first.
Sorry. I guess it depends on your form, like what do you write in, like what genre. But I think Suburban Review is great. I think a lot of publications in Australia are funded.
Yeah. Yeah.
It shows how bleak everything is. Yeah, it's just
Dead Press, who I published my first piece with, I would consider grassroots, and they're great in that it's very, you can talk to the editors and kind of stand your ground, but they're particularly for writers of color. So if you fall within that bracket, they're a great one to start off with, and particularly for early career writers.
Yeah, if you're under 25, VoiceWorks is great.
Oh, and VoiceWorks, of course.
Like, yeah, it's just this delicate thing, you know, because I think in like here, a lot of publications that we see are funded somehow, you know. For example, like they're funded too, but I would say they're a grassroots organization, and I would say Liminal is a grassroots organization.
Oh yeah.
And I guess there's small journals like Baby Teeth and Nico. And then there's Subbed In, who's completely DIY, run by Dan Hogan. I don't know if they're accepting anything in the moment, but they always champion anti-establishment writers, which is something that I find quite inspiring. Yeah, that's all off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, those are great ones. I'm going to wrap up before we hit 7 p.m. So thank you for everybody who asked questions, and thanks everybody for engaging and coming along to today's chat. And thank you again to Cher for joining us today. I wanted to ask really quickly, Cher, do you have any upcoming projects or works that you want to bump and plug before we wrap the session?
No, not really. No.
Okay. Just check.
Contact me if you want to.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to. Not to talk about my upcoming stuff, but you know, if you have any other questions or anything like that.
And same goes for me, actually. If anyone here, I mean, I believe everyone in the Toolkits cohort has my details, but anyone outside of it, my email is public on my website. So if you want to reach out to me, that's free reign. I just wanted to remind everyone that this session will be available on YouTube as a resource if you'd like to revisit any of tonight's conversation, and it will be captioned in the coming days. And in 2 weeks, on Wednesday, the 25th of May, our fiction facilitator, Annie Zhang, will be joined by Paige Clark for a session on craft, creativity, and publication, which will be live on the YouTube again, and will officially wrap the Toolkit's live session. So it'll be the last of 3. And I also quickly want to bump unprompted that the Emerging Writers Festival program launched yesterday. And scrolling through it, I did see quite a few events that were particularly around industry and things like pitching, if you're an early career writer who's looking for more information on that. And I do believe a few of them were digital, so you can stream in from anywhere. So have a look. It's a great program this year. And yeah, everyone in the cohort, come join us in the Teams chat, and everyone else. It was really great. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Whoever.